This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers, when you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below. This is a small protest. Of course, it's not the size that matters though, it's what you do with it. And what was done with this protest is really quite interesting. What you're looking at here is at most about 100 people gathered in front of Brett Kavanaugh's house protesting. Back in May, Politico leaked the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade early, and understandably, people gathered outside conservative justices' homes to voice their anger. They did what protesters do and have always done. They chanted rhyming slogans, held witty signs, and drummed on plastic buckets. Again, this is what it looked like. But what matters isn't so much the protest itself, it's what happened afterwards. A lot of people weren't fans of what they saw. The guy who took this video, Douglas Blair, got invited on Fox News and called it
"It's genuinely one of the scariest things I've ever witnessed."
And he wasn't the only one. As soon as this video went viral, the condemnation started pouring in. Republicans called Democrats hypocrites for not denouncing this heinous act of violence, with barely enough time to get the words out before the Dems proved them wrong. On Twitter, people did the same thing. Liberals and conservatives alike put their 2 cents in, begging protesters to be sensible and, quote, be civil civically, as one conservative pundit put it. Many came out of the woodwork with the same take. Protesting outside a justice's home is unacceptable. And the conversation became about how people protest, not why. Moments like these are the bread and butter of American politics. Every time a protest happens, conservatives stoke fears about the woke mob and liberals tone police, asking protesters to rise above and not slip into the barbarity of bullies like Trump. The Dems and Republicans use protests as a way to try to call each other out, while simultaneously sending the same message to demonstrators. Stop protesting like that. We don't like it. US politics is rife with this kind of stuff. We saw it with the BLM protest 2 years ago, the Women's March before that, and at least as far back as the 60s when MLK was leading the movement for civil rights. Every time a protest creates even the most minor disturbance, which is the point of a protest, the wheels kick into gear. People get all up in arms and start talking about the end of democracy and the need for civility. So-called comedians like Bill Maher run segments titled "Bring Civility Back into Politics," and politicians like Cory Booker go on talk shows to preach for a return of civic grace. The call for civility suddenly becomes the news item of the moment. But that's not all. After years of this kind of high-roading, the appeal to civility has basically become the Democrats' entire political platform. A platform that's best summarized by Michelle Obama's famous "when they go low, we go high." The Democrats have become incredibly attached to the idea that following strict social and institutional conventions makes them morally superior to the rest of the rabble, whether that's the protesters doing it the wrong way, or the Republicans they chide for bending the rules and being rude. We saw this philosophy of procedural superiority during Joe Biden's campaign, when he consistently reminisced about the good old days of civil, principled political arguments. Joe longs for a time when, quote, the Democratic Party still had 7 or 8 old-fashioned Democratic segregationists. You'd get up and you'd argue like the devil with them. Then you'd go down and have lunch or dinner together. The political system worked. You all remember those great times, right? When the political system worked so well and it was full of segregationists. The thing is, buddying up to segregationists aside, this sentiment that Joe is playing on seems reasonable to most people. At the end of the day, we all want to live in a world where we treat each other with civility. A world where every conflict gets resolved with violence or intimidation is awful, and wanting respectful debate to take precedent is normal. Better than normal, it's ideal. But that's not what this is. These calls for civility are not made in a vacuum, and they aren't made with the goal of real democratic resolution in mind. These are cynical demands to do politics through government, an institution politicians know will kill these demands for justice. A place where they will be watered down at best and outright discarded at worst. To understand what I mean, we first need to ask how this whole process works. First and foremost, the appeal to civility tries to draw strict boundaries between what is considered civil and what is considered violent. This is not a neutral process, and it's interesting to see where the lines are drawn by our politicians. Inherent to the idea that civil acts like voting or being elected and debating in Congress are preferable is the idea that they are not violent the way protests can be. But of course, it doesn't take much to see how wrong that is. When protesters gather on Kavanaugh's street, they are doing so precisely to resist violence carried out by the government. They are protesting losing their rights. the guarantee of full control over their bodies. They're protesting the sudden explosion of unsafe abortions and the predictable rise in deaths that will come with it. According to one study, that's going to look like a 21% increase in pregnancy-related mortality across the country, which will be even worse for people of color, with a 33% rise in deaths. That is on top of the fact that the US already has the highest maternal mortality rate in the imperial core. People are protesting the imminent prosecution and possible imprisonment of hundreds if not thousands of people. Complications during pregnancy will become more fatal than they were before, with last resort use of abortion as a treatment suddenly off the table in many states. Femicides will go up. This means thousands of preventable deaths and untold preventable suffering. For millions of people, the end of Roe is a sudden, tremendous upsurge of very uncivil, very predictable violence, and a protest in front of a justice's house hardly comes anywhere near it. But if you listen to the way Democrats and Republicans talk about the government, at least in its ideal imagined form, it would never seem that way. The government is never held responsible for this kind of violence. It's always the protesters that are violent. The principled debates in the assembly, the decisions made by the Supreme Court, the enforcement of laws by judges and overly militarized police forces. These are all just procedures. It's civil, it's well organized, it's legitimate, and therefore, even when the consequences are brutal, it's not even really violence. Kavanaugh doesn't deserve all this violence on his doorstep. He deserves to live a normal, peaceful life. All he did was vote in a way that you didn't like, and there's nothing violent about voting. It's easy to see how the contrast between angry people yelling and people in suits talking quietly reflects this idea. And that's the image politicians like to invoke when they're talking about civility. But the state has never been a non-violent institution, the American government especially. For starters, the liberal regimes most of you watching this video live under are entirely the product of bloody, violent revolutions, like those in France and the US. Nobody voted the king away or acted all that civilly. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Thousands of early Americans participated in the genocide of Native Americans that is still going on. Today, the state relies on the tremendous violence of the police, the carceral system, and the military, with the US accounting for nearly 25% of the world's prison population and spending more money than the next 10 countries combined on its armed forces. There's more. Every day, the governments we live under choose not to end homelessness, poverty, and malnutrition, despite these measures being well within our means, and in so doing, subject millions of people to a more structural form of violence. Governments allow and often encourage fossil fuel companies to destroy local environments and rip through reservations with oil pipelines that have a historic record of failure. That's more violence. Without needing to go back very far, we can see that the liberal government we live under survived for generations by capturing and enslaving human beings. These same liberal governments also colonized entire continents, crushing their native populations without remorse. And once colonialism was formally ended in many parts of the world, former colonies were kept under the imperial boot in a series of neo-colonial, neoliberal market reforms. At times, governments even carry out direct, very targeted violence against their own people in horrific acts like the MOVE bombings that wiped out an entire block, or the removal of Fred Hampton in his sleep. Government, and specifically the kind of government that you most likely live under, is tremendously violent. It's not civil at all. It's just very efficient and formal with the way it conducts its violence. When politicians are confronted with this evidence, which frankly doesn't happen very often, their last resort is to rely on the idea that this violence is legitimate. The violence may exist, and it may be deplorable, but it is ultimately publicly sanctioned. The way this violence gains its legitimacy in the 21st century is by claiming that all this awful stuff is just what the people want. At the end of the day, in liberal democracies, the government acts as nothing more than a mouthpiece for the will of the public. So if something bad happens, it's just because the people wanted it to, or they just didn't vote hard enough. This is how Obama recently explained it in an interview for a show that he produced. In this clip, Obama was just asked why the massive desire for change and an end to much of the state's violence in 2008 never materialized. Obama responds by saying,
"Except it turns out Mitch McConnell was elected too." Right? Precisely because the country is a big, diverse, complicated place. Look, Here's the thing that
The idea here is that because people are just so different in this big country, putting an end to this violence is too difficult. We need to compromise. Except Obama's time in office was full of moments where he led the charge on increasing the state's violence without facing any resistance. For a long time, Obama was called the deporter-in-chief because of how aggressively he pursued the deportation of, at the conservative end, 2.5 million people. His legacy is also one of over 540 drone strikes and hundreds of civilian deaths, also unopposed by the Republicans he's trying to pin the blame on. Obama also imposed, once again without staunch opposition, the brutal austerity politics that made the 2008 crash so violent for millions of Americans. The banks were bailed out, but many Americans were just left out to dry in sudden, brutal poverty. And it wasn't because Americans disagreed with one another, it's because their voice didn't matter as much as those of business interests. This is because, unlike what Obama is trying to convey, the government is not an impartial institution. The state is not a perfect expression of democratic will. It is the crystallization of class dynamics. When they act, our capitalist governments do not exclusively consider the public's demands. Every decision, whether small or large, gets filtered through the long-term preservation of capitalist interests. While some decisions the public supports make it through, many do not. And imposing that corporate filter is precisely what the appeal to civility is trying to do. By calling for civility, by insisting that the only legitimate channels for political change are those of the government, liberals and conservatives alike are intent on submitting every desire for change to the approval of the ruling class. If that sounds a bit far-fetched to you, consider this. Researchers have found that in over 20 years of congressional voting records, the preferences of the bottom 90% of the population have, quote, a minuscule, near-zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. Near zero. Almost nothing. That begs the question of who does have influence if not the public. And helpfully, the same study goes on to say, when a majority of citizens disagrees with economic elites or with organized interests, they generally lose. Our elected leaders can act in our interests, they just don't if it conflicts with those of capitalists. This is because, at the end of the day, our elected leaders run on campaigns that need to be funded by billionaires. They are personally invested in the stock market to the tune of millions of dollars, and they are consistently and overwhelmingly lobbied by business interests. The US government, like many all over the world, was founded by liberal thinkers who sanctified the private ownership of productive resources, and in so doing, created government institutions that would always protect this right, even when it conflicts with the well-being of the population. The American government is not neutral. By constructing it as the only civil way to do politics, those critical of protesters are intent on keeping politics in favor of some over others, and shutting up those who speak out. If all that wasn't enough, it's important to remember what's being asked of protesters here, in real terms. Protests never begin as violent. Almost every protest movement that's had any element of violence or generic uncivility has come after decades of by-the-books peaceful protesting being casually ignored. Decades of state-sanctioned, pre-approved protests that do not produce even the mildest discomfort. People protested to enshrine abortion for decades before showing up in front of Kavanaugh's house. The movement for Black Lives was not only overwhelmingly peaceful, the few instances of violence only appeared after generations of black suffering being systematically ignored. People asking protesters to remain peaceful at all costs are doing so knowing full well that they have had their chance to hear them out. Think of it like this. If the purpose of a protest is to force the government to act on something, and the government is the one telling you what is an acceptable protest, do you really believe they'd allow a protest that would actually make them uncomfortable or force their hand in any way? Of course not. The people calling for civility in a society with this power distribution recognize that the outcome of their proposed civility would be the maintenance of the status quo. The status quo that benefits them, those at the levers of power, and the violent state apparatus they wield. As much as we can wish that asking nicely for things will solve all our problems, history has shown us that simply won't be the case. In every era, it has been the actions of countless ordinary people working together to force the change they want to see. Throughout history, protests, demonstrations, and mass movements have always been the main drivers of real change. If you'd like to learn more about one of the most iconic of these movements, I highly recommend you check out King, a filmed record on CuriosityStream. This two-part documentary follows MLK and the civil rights movement from 1955 to 1968, through all the state violence and repression. It's a fantastic watch. CuriosityStream is an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. They've got thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. As I've shared with you all many times before, YouTube doesn't treat its creators very well, especially channels with content like mine. That's why some of my creator friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. CuriosityStream has supported our efforts from day one, so we're super happy to be able to offer this bundle deal and get you all access to Nebula basically for free. Nebula is home to content from all your favorite YouTubers, all completely ad-free. Between the two platforms, there really is something for everyone. And by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content like my original series, The New F Word, which YouTube would never allow on its platform. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous content by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.